As Nick explained, I look at relationships between men, bodies, media, place, and emotional life. And I sometimes do this through surfing, although I don't get to do it that often, not as much as I'd like, because the academy doesn't tend to take it so seriously. So currently, I'm looking at how some relationships are playing out at several big wave locations around the world. So Mullaghmore Head and Aileens in Ireland, and Cape Solander in Australia, and Nazaré in Spain. I'm thinking through some issues around homosociality, care and safety. That's why I'm researching these places and the men who frequent them. So placing oneself at risk is a major element for some of these people. And that risk-taking and looking at that risk-taking is nothing particularly new, such as Irving Goffman looked at voluntary risk-taking in his analysis of action, which involves activities that are undertaken for what is felt to be their own sake. So what are known as action sports, which involves things such as surfing, skateboarding, parkour, snowboarding, fit well with this category of Goffman's. Although there's lots of debate about what to call them actually, whether they're called action sports or lifestyle sports, but that's a debate for another time and another seminar. So I'm just going to go with action sports today. Now, the men I deal with in these locations work very hard to sort of frame their life in terms of controlling their emotions and policing where, how, and when they can be displayed, and how they talk about them or narrate them through their relationship to the activity. Goffman was spot on when he argued that the risk-taking is thought to instill character, and there's an emphasis on the ability to display it to others. And he writes how that character refers to things such as stoicism, composure, the ability to perform under pressure with apparent ease, etc. And the men that I deal with often refer to the big wave surfing and risk-taking as character building. Mind you, as I've found out, they have wildly emotional lives. And these lives fluctuate depending on space and time. So what they're experiencing before they go surfing is very different to what they experience during the surf, after the surf, and what they experience while they're waiting for the surf. So their men's emotional lives are very emplaced. So, which involves a situational and relational coming together of sort of things such as the material, the social, the cultural, and more than human. So in short, their lives are very messy, even though they like to employ strategies that try to sort out or structure or direct or contain this messiness. And they do that by employing certain traditional masculine narratives and tropes when they represent what they're doing. Now, in my research, I can get the men to talk about their emotional lives, and to define emotions. They're how we culturally and consciously interpret, appraise, categorize, label, and express what a body registers. But for me, that's not enough. I want something more than that. I'm interested in the affective lives of these men. And effects occur between people and things, which is more of a challenge, as these tend to be pre-personal and unconscious sensations of bodies in relationship with each other in the world. So for an example, you might think about when they hear the sound of a set of waves cracking on the reef of a particular surf spot, some of them feel at home, while those who are unfamiliar with that setting, it'll generate a sense of fear. So emotion works with the effect. So in reality, it's not even possible to attend to one and not the other to understand the embodied meaning making that I'm trying to get at. Now, one of the issues that I face is that I do all this in the sea. And it's not an easy place to conduct research. I've had to seek out methods that would enable me to gather the data with the participants while them and I are on the move and being swept around by the ocean. I learned a lot from reading Sarah Pink's work, actually, and Michael brought up Sarah's work about multisensoriality. And Pink looked at energy use. In one of her pieces of research, she looked at energy use in the home and used multisensory research methods. So she used things such as diaries. She tracked domestic artifacts. She produced video tours of the home and examined everyday practices. And as she explains, these methods were used to pick up on how people move through and use the home to draw out the sensations, feelings, and memories that affect their consumption of energy. And I'm trying to do the same sort of thing, to draw out those sensations, feelings, and memories. Further, also, I've tried to take up the challenge that James Lorimer put forward, which is a challenge for us to find better ways to get at some of the fleeting moments and fleeting encounters, the precognitive triggers, affective intensity, sensuous dispositions that make a critical difference to our experiences. So when I'm out in the water, everything's happening quickly, and then it slows down. So there's varying intensities, and when it's slowed down, I can get a handle on things. But then as soon as a set of waves arrives, everyone's scrambling in all sorts of different directions. It's hard to make sense of what's going on. And they don't necessarily, later when you talk to them, they don't really, it's difficult for them to explain what they're doing, when they do it, why they did it, how they felt at the time, because they're not really thinking about it. It becomes part of just what they do. It's sort of second nature, if you like. So this working in the sea and doing this ethnography in the sea prompted me to seek out a different sort of epistemology that could better appreciate this sort of oceanic life and habitus. I was lost for a long time, and then I recently came across Karen Ingersoll's work, and she calls it a seascape epistemology stemming from Hawaiian culture, which she studied, which is arguably the home of surfing. All right, so she showed me how that seascape epistemology brings forth knowledge as contingent, as complex, and a fluid ecology of the social, material, and sensory processes that highlight the emplaced and temporal nature of experience. Now, when I started reading how she articulated this, it made a lot more sense to me than a lot of what I was being presented to in Western universities in terms of land-based epistemologies. Now, I don't mean to colonize this epistemology. I understand it's a Hawaiian thing, and I hope I don't, but I felt like I had a lot to learn from it, and I wanted to try and put it to work somehow. So it's the combination of this embodied multisensorial research combined with the sea while employing the seascape epistemology that I've been calling for myself, and to make sense of it, a sort of wet ethnography. Now, to complicate matters even further, surfing's heavily mediated. Now, as we know, in the contemporary era, there's a co-constitution of media technologies and subjectivity. So when we go surfing, we surf in a sea of media. And the enthusiast mediation plays out across e-readers, mobile phones, cameras, satellites, internet cables, drones, tablets, laptop computers, everything. Like the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is I pick up the phone, I check the buoys. This is connected to the satellites. We check the wind. Calls go round what we call the coconut line. We turn up in a location. People take a photo on Instagram. This is sent to a certain group, and then we come together at a particular location. Now, returning to the notion of action, according to Goffman, if we recall, he was arguing that risk-taking can instill character, and there is an emphasis on the ability to display it to others. And this ability to display it to others is not enough. You don't have to necessarily be there anymore. Okay, everyone uses the cameras, such as the GoPro action camera, or taking photographs before they paddle out or after they paddle out, to communicate and display that character. So surfing media has, well, since it began, been driven to try and communicate what surfing feels like. We use, when you write for surfing magazines, and I wrote for a few surfing magazines, you use very particular language. Sensational action photographs were of course favoured, because what we're trying to wrestle with is how language couldn't communicate what it felt like. And even photographs had trouble communicating what it felt like. And I always remember the surf historian, that's what he calls himself, Matt Warshaw, and he wrote down this, and it connected with me. He wrote, "I don't need paper and ink. I need a 24-karat gold monster cable speaker wire with one end plugged into backdoor pipeline and the other soldered onto your adrenal gland. I need elongated vowel sounds and exaggerated hand movements. Can you feel it? Did it work? Do you have any idea what surfing is really like?" When I read that quote, arguably for me, when I'm doing this ethnography and doing it in the sea, it's the same problem I face as a researcher as I try to communicate the embodied and placed experience that these men go through. So what I did is I turned to the GoPro camera, and I've been experimenting with this point of view camera for quite a long time now, mostly failing for all sorts of reasons. I use sort of 120 frames per second, so I can slow it down and see detail, and I can play around with the footage a little bit more. Now, I'm not the first person to do this. A lot of people have done this. And mobile video ethnography, people have used it to look at everything from running to walking to cycling to climbing, and even scuba diving. There's more recent research in scuba diving. And it's argued by these various researchers that it can help us tap into that affective and pretextual dimensions. But it can also help us evoke and produce the embodied sensory and emotional knowledge. So Justin Spinney, he argues that video cameras to some extent can allow others to be, see and feel there. Now, that's a big claim. I'm not sure whether that's even possible, because as soon as you see the footage, you're in a different place, the sensation is modified, it's mediated. You can get a sense of being afraid, you can get a sense of the pride of taking off on a wave, but it's not going to be quite the thing as facing down a 30-foot wave before it lands on your head. So, and Vanini and Stewart argue that the GoPro enables scenes that could not be seen in any other way. So when they made that claim, it reminded me of how if you don't have, say, certain ocean skill, you're never going to get to see some of these experiences or see the way different waves break, or the interactions of these people in these and their social hierarchies in the sea. Or you may even be excluded. Like, for example, there's certain places where you are allowed to go and aren't allowed to go depending on where you live. Your gender will often play a role, whether you get connected in to that mobile network and get called up when certain swells are arriving or not arriving. So you could be excluded based on your subjectivity. So I think there is something there enabling things to be seen in ways that you may not otherwise get to do so. Now, it's been possible for me to analyse video footage that gets uploaded online, and I often contact various people who've uploaded footage, and I ask for permission, and we have a bit of a chat about them doing it. But the thing is, when most people upload this GoPro footage, they have soundtracks and they have music and they edit it into a particular form, and they cut out like most of what happens. And most of what happens is sitting in the lineup staring at the horizon, bobbing up and down, having a chat to your friends. It may be a chat about what you cooked for dinner, to picking up the kids from school, only to have everything, all conversations stop as you all quickly paddle for the horizon as the next set arrives. So most of the time it's not spent riding waves, it's spent interacting and having a different emotional experience, but this is all cut out, and I want access to that. So what I've tried to do, and sometimes I've done, I've attached the cameras to various people's surfboards when they've left me, and they have solo effort. It's pretty easy to operate the camera. It's an on and off button, and they just leave it running for the whole session. Sometimes they prefer to use a helmet, and so I have a couple of helmets and cheap cameras because I tend to lose the cameras. When I attach them to the helmet, they get washed away. There's no research funding for any of this, by the way, so it all comes out of my own pocket, so it gets expensive. All right, so sometimes when they're more experienced, and a lot of the guys are quite experienced surfers, and they already use these cameras on a regular basis, they will be able to just paddle out with them with strapped to their wetsuits, and they'll carry it in their hand or in their mouths when surfing. Of course, this requires a certain level of skill and confidence, and can't be used if I'm doing research with people with less skill or beginners, as the case may be. I also try and do go-alongs. These have most of the time been an abject failure because it's really hard for me to stay in position. I'm often getting swept around, especially at certain locations when it's big surf. I'm normally trying to save my own skin half the time. But then that said, sometimes it does work, and sometimes we do gather some interesting footage, and I've managed to pick up on certain things of what they're doing and how they're feeling about a situation. But I tend to find the best footage comes from when they attach to their boards and the camera's facing them. And it picks up their facial expressions, their body techniques, and their body movements. So a couple of considerations. The sea, particularly where I'm doing this, the conditions tend to be pretty tricky and pretty fickle. So when you're trying to do this in large waves, where these men surf, the currents are like rivers. So and it's easy and it's powerful waves, so the equipment gets washed away. And also, I don't know why this happens to be the case, but all the locations tend to get really foggy. So often I'll come back and the fog's ruined. You can't really see anything at all. However, you can hear things. And this sound, I'll talk about this soundscape in a moment. Then there's the fact of sometimes I'm just simply not allowed to use cameras. And this brings me to the issue of sort of the cultural codes that come to using such an ethnographic method in some locations. So some places, they're meant to be off the grid. You're not allowed to even break out your mobile phone. Now, this might not mean much to many. Say you were an ethnographer and you turned up and you had no investment in that culture personally. But for me, I belong to this culture and I go to these places, and to break those cultural rules come with serious consequences for me. I wouldn't be able to go back. So I have to sort of respect those cultural codes. They determine when and how I'll undertake this ethnography, and I have to check it out every time, ask permission. Then there's sort of a bit of obvious technological limitations. So, of course, the camera can't capture internally what these men are experiencing. They can't capture the tingling of skin. It doesn't capture their quickened heartbeats and other affective signals. It's limited to what's visible and audible. So what I tend to do, what does help, is when it works best when my body and camera are working together. And I tend to rely increasingly on auto ethnography. I tend to find that quite productive. Then, as Michael said, they're very often very aware of the camera. I mean, it's right there in front of them on the board. They pay attention to the camera. Sometimes they perform for the camera. It determines and shapes how they'll surf the wave, risks they'll take. Often when they have the camera, sometimes they say they take risks or do things that they wouldn't normally do to look good for the footage. But it depends on the participant. Many of the participants are so used to the GoPro camera now that they just basically get on with it. They just ignore it. It's become part of who and what they do when they're in the water. So it's nothing out of the ordinary for them. Increasingly, it was much easier a while ago to get people to participate. Recruitment's been a bit of a problem lately because they're telling me that they find that this distracts from their experience of going surfing. They don't actually want to have to deal with the camera and worry about it. Right? They don't want to worry. Is it on? Are they going to lose it? And as they sometimes say to me, they worry about what others will think, because there's a code of masculinity when it comes to this. When it comes to sort of what you could call saltwatery selfies. You know, they say it's too narcissistic to get this footage of themselves. They don't want it's a sort of feminized vanity. No, I just do this. This isn't. I don't want people to think that I'm looking at myself. And there's a policing of this in the water often. Now, so some of the benefits. Oops. So I find the camera helps me to examine practices that I, or particularly my institution, might perceive to be too risky to take part in. And also where sort of, you know, as I said earlier, other factors prohibit my participation. The camera is really effective at picking up on facial expressions, which is a prime organ of effect. And it's really effective at picking up on body techniques that they don't really think about because they've become second nature to them. So when we surf, often you're not really thinking about it. If you're thinking about what you're doing in the surf, particularly in these locations, you're in trouble in the first place. You should be acting on automatic pilot. So what the camera does pick up for me is what Ian Borden used to describe in terms of skateboarders when they're going through the city. And he talks about how the body is not mechanical, it's stylish. It's an economy of motion which goes beyond a set of physical acts. And the camera really does pick up on that. You'll see, depending on the angle it's put at, you'll see the bodies move in quite a fluid motion. The way the feet move up and down the board, the hand gestures, etc., the arching of the back when they're paddling, etc., the techniques they use to get under the waves. Also, it enables me the camera picks up on what Karen Barad would call that post-human performativity, right? The way that the reef and the wave energy and the sand and the wind and the surfboard come together. It really articulates that quite well, you know, as the board gets washed around during wipeouts or as they ditch their boards when they don't make a takeoff, etc. So overall, I do find the camera helps me to record, recall, and present a wider symphony of what's going on than relying just on my body and interviews when I'm back on shore. All in all, it is helpful, okay? But one of the things that I like to point out when I'm doing this is that the camera is not just a witness to all this, right? The camera for me is not just an ethnographic tool. It is part of how I come to know, right? It's for instance, it folds into everything they and I do. Its technical affordances shape how things will come forth and emerge for us, right? So we end up with certain body movements or collective embodiments. What we're doing is not separate. What I do as an ethnographer and what they do as surfers is not separate to the media technology, but they're emerging together into sort of some mediated surfing body. And I'm quite comfortable with that. You know, I have no problem when people say trying to get some objective, I'm not really interested in sort of the camera disappearing from this. The camera being entirely present is fine for me, given it's the role it now plays already in that surfing experience and their emotional experiences. So you can think about, like, the camera tends to have a fisheye lens, right? And one of the things that does, it tends to make these large waves look a hell of a lot smaller, which the guys don't particularly like, right? So they're often then trying to justify, when they come back on shore, just how large the wave is, what they experienced, and they start to sort of talk about the emotional experience. It tends to come out. So not only does it make the waves seem smaller, but that fisheye lens generates a conversation around emotions, which is really quite interesting to me. So through such technologies, drift, he sort of argues, what was formerly invisible or imperceptible becomes constituted as visible and perceptible through a new structure of attention. So to reiterate, the camera's material technical architecture is woven through the wet ethnography and these men's emotional lives. Now, more recently, this attentiveness has shifted some of my considerations. So what happened was I was coming in, and a couple of times something went wrong with my camera and I couldn't see anything. It was just black, right? But the audio was still working. And so it was only recording the sounds. So the camera's failure reminded me that sight, hearing, smell, and taste and touch bring the self into contact with the world in different ways, getting distinct orderings of the space and time. So then I started to think about how a radical shift in a person's sensorium changes their experience of these emotional lives, environment, and themselves. For example, to not have vision. So I was prompted to consider, what are the differences between the visual and non-visual seascapes and the associated experiences of space and self they produce. To find out a little bit more, I know a guy called Derek Rubilla. He's a blind surfer. So I went and asked him. And in effect, to summarize what he had to tell me, his space is reduced to his own body. And he tends to know the position of his body, not by what he sees passing, of course, but the rate, the speed, the intensity of speed, and how long that speed lasts for. So his sense of space is measured by time and intensity, which was a completely different orientating of the seascape. So what do I do with the footage? Sometimes I have people just basically watch the footage with me and we go over it, and they tell me about what they remember about that particular experience. It's a sort of, as Michael spoke about, a descriptive aid. But I also have them reflect on what happens, what they experience when collecting the footage, because I'm interested in relating how that, what that teaches me about conducting this ethnographic research. Sometimes I watch the footage with people from different subjectivities to get their different take on what they see happening, and I compare that to how the tropes and narratives those men use to describe what's going on. But also I try to remember to employ my own. Lately, I've been playing around with my own senses during the analysis. So, for example, not actually watching the visuals of the footage, just plugging in my headphone and listening to what went down to get a different sense of what's happening in that seascape. So what this has produced for me in terms of outputs is lots of problems. I tend to favour storytelling. So in Australia, we had a tradition of fictocritical research writing, which came out of feminist work, and I picked up on that. I think that there's also, I don't know much about it, but ethnographic fiction. The reason why I picked up on this sort of writing is because I wanted to get beyond just simply telling stories about people having bodies, and I wanted to address people as sensual bodies. Of course, this approach is at odds with much academic tradition, but even more at odds is now I'm playing around with film, soundscapes and installation, making with some of the participants, because I want the ethnographic data to not simply be text or signs to be decoded for their meaning, but a sense experience in and of itself. Of course, by doing this, one of the things that comes up, and Michael hinted towards this, is institutional barriers. It's really quite difficult to sort of have this justified in this sort of, in the modern university where everything's got to be quantifiable and it's got to be published in certain journals, and one has to measure certain impact, particularly here in the UK through an evaluation framework. These sort of productions don't tend to sit very neatly with that those sort of institutional demands. So it tends to, this whole process that I'm been talking about, sort of has to be sort of sit as a sideline research avenue for me, and never gets to sort of take up that central role. And sort of I have to come in and out of it, which is always quite frustrating. And I'd like to I'd like to have that discussion about how people deal with those sort of institutional barriers. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully people got something out of that.